The wind howled against the windows of the Croft family's new home, a sprawling but dilapidated farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The move was supposed to be a fresh start. For years they had tried to escape the shadow that had loomed over them, events that began in whispers, festered into screams and ended in blood. But the past has sharp claws, and sometimes it follows you no matter how far you run. It began the morning they noticed the truck parked at the edge of the property line. Old, rust-eaten and caked with dried mud, it looked like it had been dredged from a swamp. There was something unsettling about the vehicle, something that made their skin crawl when they looked at it for too long. Its windows were dark, and when the wind blew it seemed to creak like a hungry animal. That afternoon the neighbour appeared. He was tall and gaunt, with skin that hung loosely over his bones, stretched like wax melted in the sun. His face was hollow-cheeked and expressionless, his lips pulled tight, almost invisible against his greyish skin. His eyes, pale and milky, never blinked. He moved with a deliberate slowness, as if every step was carefully chosen to be as quiet as possible. From the upstairs window, Sarah Croft, the eldest daughter, watched him for hours as he stood motionless near the property line. He simply stared at the house, his presence casting a shadow over the otherwise sunny afternoon. Her chest grew tight with a dread she couldn't explain. It felt like a memory trying to crawl its way up from the pit of her mind, something she had buried years ago. That night, the family heard noises outside. Soft, scratching sounds like nails being dragged against the siding of the house. When the father, Alan, went outside to check, the yard was empty, except for strange markings in the dirt spirals and jagged shapes that seemed to bleed into one another. He covered them with gravel before returning to bed, but as he walked back into the house, he could have sworn he heard faint guttural chanting carried on the wind. Days passed, and the neighbour's presence grew more suffocating. They would find him in places he shouldn't be, standing just beyond the tree line at dusk, crouched at the end of the driveway, motionless on the edge of the property like a scarecrow left to rot. And always, he was watching. Then the animals started to die. The Crofts woke one morning to find a trail of blood leading from the edge of the woods to their porch. It was thick and dark, soaking into the wood like ink. They followed it to discover a goat lying at the threshold of their front door, its throat sliced open so cleanly it looked surgical. Its eyes were wide, its mouth frozen in a silent scream. Alan buried it at the back of the property without a word. The next night, the family cat was found in the same spot. Its body had been contorted unnaturally, as though every bone had been shattered and rearranged. Tufts of fur were scattered around like ash, and its paws had been deliberately broken, as if to keep it from running away. By the time they found the third carcass, a deer nailed to the barn wall, its entrails spilling down like wet ropes, Sarah remembered. Years ago, when Sarah was just a child, her family had been targeted by a cult that called themselves. They believed that the soul could be siphoned from the body through pain and sacrifice. Their rituals were grotesque, leaving their victims mutilated but alive just long enough to feel every second of their torment. The Crofts had narrowly escaped, but the scars ran deep. Sarah remembered the faces of the cult members, hollow and lifeless, with smiles that didn't belong on human faces. And now, standing at the edge of their property, the neighbour raised a hand in greeting, his smile stretched wide. A sudden realization crashed over Sarah like ice water. He was one of them. That night, the Crofts locked every door and window, but it didn't matter. The scratching began again, louder this time, more insistent. It came from all sides of the house, as if dozens of hands were raking their nails across the walls. Upstairs, Sarah could hear heavy breathing beneath her bed. When she mustered the courage to look, there was nothing there but blackness. At midnight, the power went out. Darkness swallowed the house, and in the silence, they heard footsteps inside. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone barefoot on wood. Alan crept through the house, flashlight shaking in his hand. When the beam of light hit the living room, He froze. The walls were covered in symbols drawn in blood, symbols that brought back memories of the basement where the Hollowed had once tied him down. In the centre of the room stood the neighbour, his face mere inches from the light. His mouth hung open now, wider than should have been possible, stretching as if his jaw had unhinged. A low, humming sound erupted from his throat, vibrating the very air in the room. The family ran. They bolted through the front door and into the night, but the woods were waiting. Figures stepped out from the darkness, their faces masked in burlap sacks, bodies cloaked in robes that writhed and whispered as if alive. They carried blades, jagged and rusted, and their presence seemed to make the air grow thick and cloying. The Crofts were dragged back to the house. Sarah was the last to be taken. As she fought against the hands that gripped her, she saw her parents pinned to the ground, their mouths sewn shut with twine. The neighbour loomed above them, holding a blade carved from bone. He traced the tip of it across their skin, slicing shallow cuts that bled just enough to stain the floor. His voice rose in a chant that filled the house, a language Sarah couldn't understand but felt deep in her bones, like worms writhing beneath her skin. They bound Sarah to a chair in the basement. Around her candles flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The symbols were everywhere, pulsing like living things. The neighbour stood before her, his face now completely devoid of features, as if the skin had been smoothed over like clay. The chanting grew louder, joined by the voices of the other figures, their words rising to a fever pitch. Then the cutting began. Sarah's screams echoed through the house, swallowed by the darkness outside. The neighbour worked slowly, deliberately, carving patterns into her flesh. Her blood pooled on the floor, seeping into the wood, feeding something ancient and hungry. As the room spun and her vision blurred, Sarah saw the shadows on the walls begin to move on their own. Long, twisted shapes that danced and writhed, reaching out with skeletal fingers. When the Crofts were finally found weeks later, the house was abandoned, the walls stained dark with blood. The symbols remained, carved into every surface, their edges still glistening as if freshly cut. The basement was the worst. There in the centre of the floor lay 4 bodies arranged in a circle, their flesh carved with intricate designs. Their faces had been removed, leaving smooth, blank masks of skin. No trace of the neighbour was ever found. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees, those who live nearby say they can hear faint chanting carried on the breeze, and the sound of nails scratching against wood. And at the edge of the property, where the Crofts once lived, an old truck sits rusting in the grass. Its windows are dark, but sometimes, if you look closely, you can see something pale staring back, waiting.